I came to the University of the Western Cape in 1962. I was 17 years old. I was still technically 16 when the university opened. I would become 17 in that year, the next month, so to speak. And I came as a theology student. In those days, we had what we call a one-year admission course, admission to the study of theology. And that happened here. So after that first year, we left and went to the seminary of the Dutch Reformed Mission Church, which was then situated in Wellington in the Boland. We stayed there for 2 years or so and then came back when the seminary was changed from Wellington to the campus of UWC. And so I had the first life of student was among the other students. We had our classes on the main campus as much as that was, and studied with the other students from biblical studies to sociology and those kinds of things. Left then, studied theology, came back. But the campus in 1963 was not especially restive at that point. I think students had come here, we had no choice, of course. I couldn't go anywhere else. If they say that you needed 1 year of university classes in order to be admitted to the seminary for theology, that's where you had to come. Because I was from the Dutch Reformed Mission Church, that is the so-called colored branch of the white Dutch Reformed Church, as part of that family. The white Dutch Reformed Church, of course, is the mother of apartheid. Apartheid is, historically speaking, ideologically speaking, the brainchild of the white Dutch Reformed Church. The theology of apartheid came afterwards as a justification, but the ideology of apartheid started way back in 1857 when the Dutch Reformed Church made its first decisions concerning its so-called mission policy. And that mission policy became the template for the apartheid policy as a political entity and as a political construct and as a political reality. So the Dutch Reformed Church and apartheid as a policy are like one. When the National Party won for the first time at the polls in 1948, with Dr. Malan, who was also a white Dutch Reformed Church minister, the Kerkbode, that's the official organ of the Dutch Reformed Church, wrote an editorial in which they joyfully jubilated the victory at the polls for the National Party. And they had this wonderful, truthful and very revealing sentence in it. As people move into this new era, they must remember, they said, that apartheid is a church policy. And so this is the church claiming victory and ownership of a political policy and a political construct that would form the reality for South Africa for the next 50 years. And so it is that intimate relationship that we're talking about. And so I grew up, as all of my colleagues and all of my friends and family, so within that ideological mindset. And the NG Zendenkerk, the Dutch Reformed Mission Church, established in 1881, was a direct result of that mission policy in which the separation of the races in church was accepted as a basic principle for the church. They did not claim it to be a biblical principle. They said, we know the Bible says differently. However, for us, in our situation, practically, this is what would work best. And that would be the refrain that apartheid was practically the best policy, the only policy. It almost, and with the theology, it almost became a phrase bordering on salvation, the salvation of the white race, the salvation of civilization, the salvation of South Africa, and also, by the way, the salvation of the natives and the savages and all these other people. That's apartheid. So that's the Dutch Reformed Church. And so you must then remember that the Dutch Reformed Church will do everything in its power to strengthen the policy of apartheid. And so when this Bush College, like the other black Bush colleges, was established, one of the first things that they knew and that they understood was that the Dutch Reformed Mission Church, which had a huge presence in the so-called colored community at the time, a very influential church in our communities, if this church could bring its theological training away from where it was, isolated in Wellington, to here, to this campus, to give strength and to give further name and establishing itself on the campus of the specially invented colored university. It would make the mission of this university, in terms of the colored people, forming colored intellectuals for the colored purposes of the apartheid regime, making sure that people with a degree would be able to defend, because this is where they come from, they would hear nothing else. It would be an ideological training of their mind, a colonization of their mind, that in the white apartheid mind was to be a permanent project, generation after generation after generation. If they bring one of the most important institutions in the colored community, and link that up with the natural spirituality of our people and the fact that people put so much trust in the church, as if they can bring the church here so that the church could bless the existence of this colored university, that would be an enormous push for the plan in general. And so within that framework is how you have to understand why Wellington was closed and UWC was established for us. And later on, it was first just a separate seminary and would only become a faculty later on. But being here as a student in 1963, I came here as a student, I did my studies, I met my friends, we talked church, we talked theology. We did not talk anything much. There was no idea that on that campus there might be something brewing. I don't think there was much brewing in those first years. I think that the campus, politically speaking, really became alive towards the end of the 1960s, when I had already left, when black consciousness became the sort of the driving principle of political thinking, and that for the first time on this campus, there became real such a thing as student politics. What those student politics would do to this campus and to the community and to South Africa as a country and to the struggle for freedom as a whole, that would become only evident in the 1970s, but especially in the 1980s. So my student life here began fairly quiet, fairly normal, nothing exceptional. I came back when the faculty was established here, not the faculty, the seminary was established here in 1964. And so we then became aware that we are now a more permanent presence on the campus, but still very isolated. They did not invite students or lecturers from that side of the campus to this side of the campus. And I don't think the students on that side of the campus wanted anything to do with lecturers on this side of the campus. Of course, we met socially, I suppose, but there was this residence here that was built for theology students. And you can see physically even how far away from the other residences that was. So it's the whole idea of coming here, blessing the campus, giving justification to the existence of UWC as a colored university, but yet making sure that the students of the church were not, so to speak, contaminated by whatever might go on that other side. Those were the goals in those days. When it became a faculty, of course, all of that changed, because then the student body became part of the student body on the other side. In my day, when I left here in 1968, end of 1967, we had fights in this room to my left, which is the large lecture hall for us in those days. We had fights, but what were those fights about? Those fights were about why were we not given a theological training on a par with that the white students of the white Dutch Reformed Church were getting in places like Stellenbosch and Pretoria and Bloemfontein. Why do we get a 4-year study, 5 years if you count the 1-year admission, and yet at the end of it, I only had a diploma? Why were we trained in our theological seminary for our church, the so-called colored church? Why were all the professors white people, missionaries sent here by the white Dutch Reformed Church? We began to question those kinds of things. And students here, some of us, not me, but other students, thought, I need to go deeper into theology. I want a degree beyond this place. And so they became students at UNISA. And you know what? The board of professors here actually called out those students, called them into a meeting, and said, if you study at any other place than this one, UNISA or anyone, you will be sent away. We will chase you off this campus. Because they were so intent that theology students, colored theology students, should know nothing else than what they were taught by these white missionary professors. We should learn nothing else. Our minds should not be tested by any other questions than those questions that they allowed. And so it was very clear that this seminary, apart from fitting into the broader ideological project that UWC as a colored university represented, there was a special project within that larger project, ideologically driven and very religiously adhered to, that these students must remain under the control of white theological thinking from the Dutch Reformed Church. And so if you keep this in mind, then you will understand what an amazing thing it was that the students from this place, with all of this, had broken with everything here and had joined the broader student movement and the struggle in South Africa in the way that they did. I mean, these people, I remember in 1965, there were 2 major fights that I was involved in here. The one was, here was a professor from Princeton University by the name of James McCord, a very famous kind of theologian, who had been invited by the white schools, Stellenbosch and Pretoria, and then they, one afternoon, graciously allowed him to come to the colored people so that he can talk to us. So he gave his lecture, and I asked a question, which he responded, and I came with a follow-up question. After that conversation, he said to me, what's your name, young man? And I told him. And he said to me, do you have any plans for the future? I said, no, I really want to study further, but there is no opportunity. And I'll probably go straight into the ministry from here. And he said, why don't you think about coming to Princeton University? He offered me a full scholarship. I said to him, what we teach here is not going to help me fit in right. He says, okay, we will build in a year of orientation for you so that you can come on a par with our students. I brought that to the board of professors. They told me the same thing that they said. They said to me, if you leave here, this country, to go and study elsewhere, you can forget about coming back. And even if you do come back, you will never be admitted as a minister in this church. That was what they told me. Now, so every avenue of breaking away from the ideological bonds and boundings and boundaries and chains of this place and the Dutch Reformed Church was closed down. The second fight that we had is in 1965. I met Reverend Beyers Nodir for the first time. He came to Somerset West, the place where I lived and grew up, He spoke at the Anglican Church. I met him, and we had a very good conversation. But he was, of course, that was 1965. By then, he had already broken with the Dutch Reformed Church. They had stripped him of his ordination as a minister in that church. He had established the Christian Institute. The Christian Institute was seen as a subversive organization, almost a communist organization by the white Dutch Reformed Church. Beyers Naudé was persona non grata. And I asked him, if you get an invitation from the students, would you come and speak to us? Yes, he said, of course. I come back here, but we had to ask permission for everything. We had a little student council here, but we were not much. And so I proposed that we get Reverend Beyers Naudé to speak. The professors went bonkers. And it was a huge fight. So we decided, okay, he can't come and speak during lecture time. We'll let him speak in the afternoon. And they said they banned every meeting in the afternoon. Then they forced the meeting. They said, okay, you can have a lecture from somebody from the outside during lecture time. You know who they brought here? Dr. Kurt Foster, the brother of John Foster, the prime minister, one of the most vociferous and vocal and uncompromising disciples of apartheid and the theology of apartheid, to come and talk to us about the dangers of liberalism. I mean, there was the guy who talked about us as the fruits of verbastering, the mongrelization of the white race. That's us. That's him. They get him to come and speak. Well, fight upon fight upon fight. But we had to sit here and we had to listen on pains of being expelled. So we had our little fights. And it was beginning to look as if we could make the connections, but not really. And that was the case, I would recall, until 1973. 1970, 1973, but 1976, when the students here at this school became fully and wonderfully involved in the struggles on the campus and outside the gates of these campuses in the community.